Hey, good afternoon, and thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Sami Ayoub. I'm an assistant professor of law and media studies at the University of Texas here, and one of the mentors for the Brumley Fellows program. Basically today I will be introducing my student, Kelsey, and Kelsey will be able to introduce our speaker for today. So before then, I'll just give you a brief idea about the program for the Brumley Fellows at the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. The Brumley Next Generation Fellows program at the Strauss Center provides research training and mentorship opportunities to exceptional undergraduate and graduate students at the University of Texas at Austin, involving students in training and international affairs early in their career, as an important part of the Strauss Center's mission to prepare the next generation of leaders to help develop solutions to the most pressing public policy challenges in the United States. The program is made possible and generous support of John and Rebecca at Brumley. Now I'll introduce Kelsey, and then we're going to go from there. So Kelsey Ritchie is a second-year graduate student at LBJ School of Public Affairs, where she is pursuing her master's in global policy studies. She is studying security law and diplomacy with a focus on national security studies. She is the graduate assistant at the Clements Center for National Security, and she is also a researcher for innovations for peace and development from on a project focusing on terrorist recruitment in Colombia, and serves as the head global writer for the Baines report. She graduated from Texas Christian University with a global degree in political science and journalism. So Kelsey hopes to continue her work in the future to pursue a PhD, but before then she would like to pursue a job in the government before doing so. So before further ado, I will just invite Kelsey to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ayoub. I just want to extend a quick thank you to the Strauss Center and to the Brumley Fellows Program for this opportunity to bring great speakers to campus that we can all learn from. So, as Dr. Ayoub mentioned, I'm a Brumley Fellow, the Brumley Fellow for Counterterrorism Studies. So, part of the program is we get to bring speakers to campus who study these types of issues. So, it is my pleasure to introduce Shirin, Sinnar, and she is an associate professor of law and the John Wilson Faculty Scholar at Stanford Law School. Her scholarship focuses on the role of institutions, including courts and executive branch agencies, in protecting individual rights and democratic values in the national security context. Her scholarship also addresses the procedural dimensions of civil rights in national security litigation, domestic intelligence gathering and terrorist watch lists, and the impact of terrorism law and policies on U.S. minority and immigrant communities. Her articles have been published or are forthcoming in the California Law Review, the Georgetown Law Journal, the Harvard Law Review, the Stanford Law Review, the Harvard Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Law Review, and many other journals. She is a graduate of Stanford Law School, Cambridge University, and Harvard and Radcliffe Colleges. So join me in welcoming Shirin Sinnar to the stage.
Thank you so much to Dr. Ayoub and the Strauss Center for inviting me here, to Kelsey for that introduction, and to the Brumley Fellows for a lovely conversation at lunchtime. We're now in the middle of a national conversation about white nationalist violence and other forms of domestic terrorism. From Charleston to Charlottesville to Pittsburgh, recent incidents have brought home our awareness of a threat that many thought had receded into history. In my view, we can arrive at a just, effective, and accountable response to political violence only when we first understand how criminal law has responded to terrorism in the years since 9/11. And that experience teaches us two things. First, that we apply two very different legal regimes to terrorism by Muslims and by others, But second, that while we do need to do much more to address the threat of domestic terrorism, we shouldn't ratchet up the law to address that inequality. So I'm going to start by taking you back to the summer of 2005. It was just a few years after September 11th. Fears of Al-Qaeda terrorism were running high. At the time, I was a young civil rights lawyer. I was working for a group called the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in San Francisco. That June, federal officials claimed that they had uncovered a terrorist sleeper cell in the town of Lodi, California. Lodi is about 70 miles from San Francisco in the agricultural heartland of the state, the Central Valley. And it made national attention because the FBI had announced essentially that there was an Al-Qaeda presence in the small rural town. At the center of the allegations was Hamid Hayat, a 22-year-old former cherry packer with only a 6th grade education. The Fed said that he had confessed to attending a terrorist training camp in Pakistan and that he planned to bomb supermarkets and hospitals. Now, federal agents were descending on Lodi's Pakistani Muslim community in a search for other terrorists. The Pakistani community of Lodi were not the well-heeled doctors and engineers that you find in some other South Asian immigrant communities. They were working-class people, neither well-off nor well-versed in the American legal system. Many had strong ties to villages in rural Pakistan. And now the entire community was under a microscope. We began to hear stories about the kind of FBI investigation that was unfolding in Lodi. So along with a couple of other civil rights lawyers, I went out to Lodi to see what was happening. And we heard from numerous Muslim residents, mostly young people, about how FBI agents were tailing them in the streets, parking in their neighborhoods, following them to work and then interrogating them there, sometimes detaining them in police vans for interrogation. And we heard these stories repeatedly, and a few nights later, when we held a Know Your Rights presentation at a nearby mosque to advise people on their legal rights, FBI vehicles circled the mosque throughout the evening in what seemed a deliberate show of intimidation. A year later, no terrorist plot or cell had materialized in Lodi, and the government had backpedaled from some of its more incendiary accusations. But prosecutors still put on trial Hamid Hayat. The charges were that he had attended a terrorist training camp in Pakistan and lied to FBI agents about it. A jury convicted him after a trial, and he was sentenced to 24 years in federal prison. Hamid Hayat's case was one of the first big terrorism trials of the post-9/11 era. It made national news not only because it was a small farming community in Lodi, but also because the case represented a new government strategy for investigating and prosecuting terrorism. Professor Bobby Chesney here called that strategy Anticipatory Prosecution and described the Hamid Hayat case at the time as epitomizing this new strategy. Essentially, the approach meant identifying individuals whom government officials believed might present a future risk of violence and charging them with material support to terrorism or some other crime early in an effort to prevent any risk from materializing. And that approach became the standard approach to dealing with suspicions of terrorism in Muslim American communities. From the government's perspective, even if there's a small chance that somebody might go on to commit an act of violence, you had to intervene early because a terrorist attack that did occur could be devastating. From the perspective of those targeted, anticipatory prosecution meant punishing people for thought crimes, mostly brown or black young people who had angry or hostile speech or ideas. It also meant surveilling Muslim communities at large, on the theory that you could only identify the few who presented a threat by putting entire communities under the microscope. So now let's fast forward to 2019. Just last month, a federal judge recommended overturning Hamid Hayat's conviction. Judge Deborah Barnes, who held a massive evidentiary hearing into the case, concluded that Hayat had failed to receive a fair trial because the legal representation he received fell below constitutionally minimal standards. But this wasn't just about some technical or procedural defect of the trial. What Judge Barnes concluded is that there was evidence not introduced at trial that could have shown that Hayat had never attended a training camp, and a jury may have acquitted him with the benefit of that evidence. The unraveling of Hayat's conviction highlights some broader issues with how the government has investigated and prosecuted terrorism cases involving Muslim defendants. Like so many other terrorism cases against Muslims, this one involved a lavishly paid government informant who had every incentive to produce a conviction. He had come to the government's attention through some earlier kind of routine criminal investigation, and he had made some fairly absurd allegations that Al-Qaeda's number 2 man was frequenting the mosque in Lodi. The government actually acknowledged at trial that those claims were highly implausible. Yet they paid this informant over $200,000 to find terrorists in Lodi. So this man befriended Hamid Hayat, a somewhat aimless young man living in his parents' garage. And after many months of cajoling him to go to a terrorist training camp, Hayat promised the informant that he would do so when he got to Pakistan. The informant had no evidence that Hayat had actually done that, but prosecutors used those conversations over a period of time to incriminate him at trial. And like other terrorism cases, Hayat's case involved inflammatory evidence related to Islam put before a jury unfamiliar with and fearful of Muslims. Prosecutors argued at trial that an Arabic prayer found in Hayat's wallet showed that he had a, quote, jihadi heart and a jihadi mind. A government expert said that only somebody preparing for holy war would carry such a prayer. In her decision many years later, the decision that came out last month, Judge Barnes concluded that other Islamic law experts could have testified at the time that the prayer was a common religious supplication without a nefarious intent. But without that kind of rebuttal, it was only too easy for a jury already afraid of Muslims to accept the government's interpretation. And we know that in that case, like others, the jury, some members of the jury harbored such fears. The foreman of the jury said after the trial that he couldn't let Hayat go free on the basis of what people of his background have acted in the past. That statement admitted prejudice, prejudging guilt, and reversed the presumption of innocence. So putting together a strategy of anticipatory prosecution, a paid informant incentivized to produce a conviction, inflammatory evidence involving Islam, and jurors already fearful, it was only too easy to convict. Hamid Hayat has now served 13 years in federal prison on the basis of a crime he likely did not commit. So it's highly unusual to revisit a conviction in a terrorism case. And I think this court decision indicates that in 2019, we're beginning to have a deeper conversation about how race, religion, and identity have affected our approach to terrorism. I think we're having this new conversation for at least 2 reasons. First, the president's explicit racist rhetoric against Muslims, Latinos, and other groups has forced us to reckon with forms of bias that we could previously ignore or deny. And second, high-profile incidents of domestic terrorism have opened up a conversation about white nationalist violence that is long overdue. And that's where I want to turn next. For many, that conversation began in earnest in June 2015. That month, Dylan Roof shot dead 9 African American men and women at a historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina. The incident brought home not only the persistence of white supremacist violence, but also the failure of government officials to recognize its political and systematic character. In the weeks after the shooting, FBI Director James Comey refused to call the incident an act of terrorism, despite Dylan Roof's stated desire to start a race war and his posting of a white supremacist manifesto online. So definitions of terrorism vary even across U.S. law. A leading federal definition identifies terrorism as activities involving violence or the threat of violence that are intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or influence government conduct. And most academic and legal definitions of terrorism require a political or ideological motive, not simply the effect of creating fear or terror. But these definitions easily cover violence intended to advance white nationalist objectives. And we've continued to face devastating incidents in recent years. So, as we know, Charlottesville brought together the largest gathering of white nationalists in a generation. It culminated in the beating of DeAndre Harris and the murder of Heather Heyer. And although the president equivocated in his response, even Attorney General Jeff Sessions recognized the attack on Heather Heyer as an act of domestic terrorism. Other attacks have targeted immigrants, Muslims, and Jews. In 2017, 3 members of an Illinois militia bombed a Minnesota mosque with the stated purpose of driving Muslims from the country. And of course, as we all know, 3 months ago, Robert Bowers killed 11 worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. His intent to send a political message was equally clear. He posted just before the shooting that he was doing it to protect the white race from Jewish charities bringing in immigrant invaders into the country. There's little hard data to confirm that incidents of white supremacist violence are increasing, in part because the federal government doesn't report statistics on threats or acts of domestic terrorism without an international connection. We do know that the FBI's annual hate crimes reports show a rise in hate violence for 3 straight years. The last report, released in November, showed a 17% rise in hate crimes in 2017. Hate crimes overlap with terrorism when perpetrators engage in violence against individuals on the basis of race, religion, or other characteristics to intimidate a larger community or influence the state. And most reported hate crimes in recent years have targeted primarily African Americans and on the basis of race or ethnicity. Although some of this rise in reported hate crimes may reflect some greater attention to reporting hate crimes, there are many other indicators of resurgent white nationalist violence. New neo-Nazi groups like the Atomwaffen Division have formed in recent years. Some of these groups engage in paramilitary training, recruit military service members for their experience in warfare, and encourage individuals to act violently on their own in an effort to preserve white dominance. So after Dylan Roof's attack in Charleston, the public conversation on race and inequality in the context of terrorism emerged, but at the time it was focused mostly on the question of labeling. What do we call particular acts of violence? And now the conversation is increasingly moving from labels to law. And we're beginning to recognize that even when authorities recognize violence as terrorism, the policing and prosecution of terrorism differs sharply across ideologies and communities. So as in Lodi, the government intensively surveils and polices American Muslim communities to root out potential threats. Law enforcement officials intercept phone calls and obtain internet records with secret warrants from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. They use a vast network of confidential informants with little oversight. They charge people with material support to terrorism in anticipatory prosecutions. And sentences are steep even for acts far removed from actual violence, especially because a federal terrorism sentencing enhancement drives up penalties. For other terrorist threats, like those stemming from white nationalists, militia members, or various groups on the left, the FBI uses conventional search warrants rather than foreign intelligence and national security tools. They rarely charge members of such groups with material support to terrorism, even when the statutory charges are available under the law. Studies suggest that the FBI does not use informants or undercover operations against right-wing threats as extensively as they do against Muslims. And local law enforcement officials prosecute many of these cases under state law, which has other effects, including that it precludes the application of the federal terrorism enhancement, sentencing enhancement, and other consequences of federal prosecution. So what accounts for these differences? One reason is that there are formal differences in the law applicable to what we characterize as international and domestic terrorism. So the international category, this is not kind of the intuitive, well, domestic is it happens here, international means it's directed abroad. It's a little more complicated than that. The international category covers threats whenever there is any international link, even if suspects are U.S. citizens acting only within the United States. And the law formally differentiates across many different areas of investigation and prosecution. One example is that the material support to terrorism laws prohibit any form of support to a foreign designated terrorist organization, but ban support for domestic terrorist groups only if a person intends to support the group's criminal activities. As applied, this distinction has an even more blunt application. So as applied, government officials largely consider threats of terrorism by Islamic extremists to be international and threats by others to be domestic, even when there is little actual difference in their geography. So for instance, the FBI groups U.S. citizens inspired by ISIS to be international terrorists, even if they have no international communication or other ties, while it views white supremacists and neo-Nazis as domestic terrorists, despite those movements increasing and often present global dimensions. Thus, the divide between domestic and international terrorism often gets applied fairly bluntly along ideological and identity lines. And second, even when the laws draw no distinction between domestic and international terrorism, law enforcement authorities in practice have treated Muslim threats very differently from other terrorism threats, especially those stemming from the far right. Now, there may be multiple reasons for this, historical and otherwise, including the scale of the 9/11 attacks and particularized fears of recruitment from ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But in examining actual incidents of terrorism in the United States and the political responses to such threats, it's hard to escape the conclusion that race, religion, and identity of suspects and victims has affected these kinds of legal responses. So the outsider status of Muslims, the widespread association of Muslims with terrorists and foreigners in the public imagination, has shaped a punitiveness not applied to white suspects of other ideologies. So if law enforcement responses to different terrorist threats reflect inequality, should we ratchet up the legal response to domestic terrorism? An increasing chorus of voices, mostly on the left, is now calling for new domestic terrorism laws. Various state legislatures and Congress are now considering proposals to enact new terrorism offenses, including proposals to create new criminal charges and ban material support to domestic terrorist organizations. In my view, the response to the very real problem of domestic terrorism needs a more nuanced and cautious approach. We can and should do more to monitor and address the threat. So we should improve data collection on both domestic terrorism and hate crimes as a start. Existing government statistics underrepresent the threat from white nationalism because they don't track domestic terrorism at all. At this point, they only track acts within international nexus. And official statistics seriously undercount hate violence for a variety of reasons. We should also devote additional analytical and investigative resources to domestic threats, including restoring the kinds of intelligence units focused on domestic terrorism that were gutted during the Obama administration under political pressure from the right. We should also direct greater attention to online hate speech that threatens individuals and legitimizes violence. And we should address the participation and recruitment of military service members by certain violent hate groups. But we should not ratchet up the legal response to domestic terrorism by enacting new terrorism charges or granting new coercive powers to law enforcement. For instance, in my view, we should not ban material support to designated domestic organizations or freeze assets on mere suspicion that individuals have engaged in terrorist activities. And both of these are among the proposals that people have raised in the last years. I say this for several reasons. First, the legal regime that we now use against international threats already jeopardizes individual rights and challenges democratic accountability in a host of ways. We ought to be restoring protections and expanding oversight of that legal regime rather than expanding it to cover more people and a greater variety of threats. And second, we know that racial inequality pervades the criminal justice system and that the FBI has a notorious history of targeting civil rights activists. So if you enhance terrorism powers, even with the aim of directing that attention towards particular groups like white nationalists, the consequences may not fall on those groups, but on the communities that have been historically targeted for their dissent. African Americans protesting police brutality, indigenous rights activists, or other historically marginalized communities. And finally, we should be careful not to frame terrorism as solely or even primarily a problem of criminal law. Many legal scholars have observed that in the US, we have this distinct tendency to think of social problems in criminal law terms. So whether it's domestic violence, whether it's drug addiction and drug use, we tend to think of these as primarily problems of criminal law that require a criminal response and usually want to enhance punishment. When it comes to domestic terrorism, as with many other challenges, we need to attend to its structural and political dimensions rather than focus only on the crimes of individual offenders. And for instance, if racist rhetoric at the highest levels of our political life emboldens white nationalist violence, then we need to address that fundamentally political problem separate and apart from the criminal law. So I'll end there, and I am looking forward to the discussion and your questions.
Wonderful. Okay, so we have some time for questions. So please raise your hand and No, Bob?
So I was so glad our faculty meeting ended, and I raced right down here. And I'm going to ask a question you may well have already answered and talked about at length, in which case I apologize, Mr. Tang. The role of undercover informants in the existing slate of cases in recent years. I'm not sure if you talked about that already, but I'm very eager in your thoughts about, do we have the right, is FBI using that tool, that potentially critical tool, but also potentially abusive tool, could go either way? Is the right amount currently? Do we need to see more of it used, less of it used? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I touched on this just a little, but I'm happy to actually talk a little bit more about it. So right now, the use of undercover informants, both confidential government agents as well as recruited informants, is endemic within the prosecution of cases involving Muslim defendants and fears of international terrorism. The same methods are used to some extent against a variety of other threats, but the evidence that we have available suggests that that use is not nearly as extensive or aggressive. And again, here the evidence is limited, but there's a study, for instance, from a criminologist, Jesse Norris, who a couple of years ago compared use of these strategies across different genres of cases based on ideology. And his conclusion was that many more of the cases involving Muslim defendants used undercover informants and government agents. Now, in terms of the balance and whether we're using this effectively or appropriately, this is actually an issue that I think is probably one of the most problematic features of our current approach to terrorism investigations and prosecutions. And I talked a little bit earlier about the notion of anticipatory prosecution, which you wrote about many years ago, and how the desire to achieve prevention in these cases led government agents to intervene at a much earlier point in time than they would normally do so. One of the major methods for identifying individuals who are believed to present some risk of future violence is the use of informants. Yet, what concerns me is a couple of things, both the fact that the incentives are so strong in favor of netting convictions, that you have individuals whose role is essentially, every incentive directs them to lead someone further along the path of radicalization to attempt an act of violence. And the many cases that have come to public light at this point involve targets of informant investigations who, on multiple dimensions, seem to be particularly vulnerable. So most of these cases involve young men. They're young. Many of them are people who are not particularly economically or otherwise well-adjusted. They, in some cases, have had fairly clear indications of mental health issues, even at the time that they are targeted by government informants. In one recent case in Chicago, where a 19-year-old was lured into essentially agreeing to commit an attack on a bar in Chicago, he was actually later found unfit for trial, and I wish I had the language in front of me, but the judge looked at him and said, well, his comments about Freemasons and Illuminati and other mystical beings make me think that he's not actually competent to stand trial. And these, when there are indications like that of particular vulnerability to the influence of an informant, the targeting of these people, I think many of whom are sort of low-hanging fruit, suggests that the convictions that come out of these cases are not necessarily cases of individuals who would have, or even if they're like ex ante looking at it, one would think that they present a high likelihood of going down that path on their own. So I think that the use of informants raises a lot of problematic challenges, and I would not want to see this expansion. It's not simply a case of the problem is that we don't use it equally. That's part of the problem, but there are other questions about how legitimate it is to intervene early on the notion that somebody will present some risk of violence eventually. Yes?
Are there best practices practices or things we could learn from programs, whether here in the U.S. or overseas, like Quilliam in the U.K. or such, that do address radicalization while avoiding some of the problematic behavior you've discussed?
I have not done a lot of kind of my own research on those programs, so I don't want to comment on particulars. What I will say is that the form in which efforts to roll out those kinds of programs, the countering violent extremism programs in the U.S., has unfolded, leave a lot to be desired. I think there were a few problems with the way that these programs were adopted and implemented. Part of the issue is that the programs were rolled out largely by the very same law enforcement agencies that were also engaging in surveillance and other forms of scrutiny of these communities. So then when the very same infrastructure is set up and pitched as a means of building trust and relationships in communities, but it also appears that one misstep can quickly put you in the crosshairs of government investigation and prosecution. That design, I think, is a design that was destined to fail and to engender a lot of mistrust. Now, what could be a better design? I don't know. I think to some extent when you have humanitarian social services programs in communities, in immigrant communities as well as others, is always a useful thing. It is important to integrate communities and help people of all ideologies, identities, backgrounds find their footing in society. So those programs have an independent value, but when they are tied explicitly to a counterterrorism goal and operated by those agencies, then I think the design becomes a bit problematic.
Thank you for coming. In light of what you said about the way that the FBI in particular has engaged with counterterrorism work up to this point, you sort of described two ways of responding to the sort of rise of white nationalism, one of which is to sort of ratchet up, one of which is to sort of turn the current mechanisms of counterterrorism sort of against white nationalists. But is there any reason to suspect that the FBI is equipped to do that? Or is the FBI just sort of fundamentally unable to see sort of right-wing activity as terrorism, in which case would marginalized communities be safer by sort of choosing a third option and just ramping down the amount of counterterrorism work that the FBI is doing?
Yeah. So I think it's a complicated question. On the one hand, we have this real history of an agency that focused very disproportionately in its history on threats emanating or perceived to emanate from the civil rights community, from African Americans, and so forth. So while, for example, the FBI did investigate and prosecute the Klan and other white nationalist organizations during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, some historical work suggests that the approach, actually a lot of historical work suggests that the approach was radically different, that they went after groups like the Klan to the extent that they were actually engaging in violence, so this very sort of laser-sharp approach to violence, whereas with most other groups they had a dragnet approach that considered entire ideologies and communities a source of a potential threat. So that's that history. And more recent indications, like I think FBI Director James Comey's reluctance to call the Charleston Act an act of terrorism, suggest that these perceptions of various threats through kind of lines of race and identity and ideology It's not just a thing of the past, right? There's also the dimension that within the institution, there's some indications that post 9/11, career paths focusing on domestic terrorism of this kind were devalued. So, that if you wanted to get ahead within the FBI, you needed to be an investigator investigating international terrorism. And so within the agency, there was a deprioritization of those threats in the post 9/11 era. So there are serious problems, I think, related to conceptualizing these acts, how the agency sees it, whether its structures are set up to respond in an equal fashion. At the same time, it's not the case that they have not gone after any of these threats or that they have simply ignored them. There has been analysis conducted of certain white nationalist groups. In fact, there's an intelligence report on the growing threat of white nationalist extremists right before Charlottesville occurred. In addition, there's a recent case out of Kansas, for instance, where several militia members were preempted in a fairly far along plot to bomb apartment complexes involving Somali immigrants. So I think it would be too blunt to say that they don't, to exaggerate their indifference to these sorts of threats. Maybe just to wrap up, I think kind of the way that I can ultimately come down on it is that given that history and those constraints, it's one thing to ask the agency to do more to investigate white nationalist violence. It's another to give law enforcement greater coercive powers or tools than they now have. And for me, that's part of the line that I draw between applying existing powers and resources in a measured way versus amping up the legal infrastructure and punishment.
I would love to hear your opinion on kind of popular assertion that the way to prevent domestic radicalization is to amplify moderate Muslim voices in the United States. And I know the United States after 9/11 really worked with certain Muslim communities and certain imams that were speaking out against the radical extreme violence. After the surveillance of Muslim communities, has the U.S. government kind of diverted any opportunity to re-engage in that sphere? Is there a potential for a relationship there? Is that an effective way of engaging with that community?
So I think I might want to push back a little bit on maybe the framing, in the sense that I think there's an assumption that the Muslim community, and I don't mean it's your assumption, I think that there's a larger societal assumption that the Muslim community is largely one that is where some large number of people within the community is kind of susceptible to flirting with violence, is sort of one step away from going down that path. And I think that assumption is problematic. So when it comes to the notion of amplifying Muslim moderate voices, I would just reframe that as amplifying Muslim voices. Because I don't think you have a situation in the United States, certainly, and this may be in contrast to some other countries for sure, but where you have people in a position of leadership in the Muslim community speaking out in support of violence. So it's not a case where you need to amplify certain voices. I think perhaps it's just a case of letting people in the communities speak for themselves. And that's a broader issue. And I think, even when you look at who are security experts, who get to be the talking heads about questions of security, who's speaking on behalf of Muslims. Many universities, you look at who are in positions of study on questions of Islam, and you'll find that Muslims are almost absent from that. So in a way, I think I would just want to reframe. I think it is important to have the voices from within the community, but I don't think it's so much about amplifying moderate voices against extremist voices, at least when it comes to people who are kind of in the public light. I think we need to kind of rethink how we see the communities at large. Yes.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for your really important and interesting resume. My question actually ties a little bit, I want to comment a little bit back on the collection techniques that you were talking about, the Lodi and subsequent other cases. My question is rather short in a sense that what other alternatives besides the informants which have the incentive to act in a certain manner which you deem to be problematic would you suggest? Or what other techniques could be applied in supplement to the informants?
So I think, let me answer that in two ways. So in terms of other techniques, I think other techniques that FBI has and also uses include things like direct interviews with individuals and people around them. So keeping tabs in that respect, having direct conversations with people in particular who the FBI has indications present a potential threat. So that would be one example. And the other example that they're already doing is surveilling social media that people already put out into the public light. So there are other investigative techniques that are available. Even within the use of informants, my position is not that they should never be used, but I think what's striking about our current system is just how little oversight we have over the use of informants. And so, for instance, at the trial, the defense that someone could raise if they think they have been entrapped, there is a legal defense of entrapment, but in practice it is extremely difficult to show, to establish that someone did not have a predisposition towards violence, which ends up being part of that legal test, and not for good reasons, I think. I think that once somebody has gone down that path and both made a bunch of inflammatory statements and taken some initial steps to violence, no jury is going to look at them and think, oh, but you wouldn't have done it otherwise. It's so practically the idea at that stage of an entrapment defense being any safeguard against overuse of the practice, I think is very limited. So then you can think, well, what other kinds of safeguards could you have in the process? And unfortunately, internal oversight over the use of informants is also quite limited. And this is also differentiated across the international and domestic terrorism categories. So formally looking at FBI guidelines, there's actually less oversight over the use of informants when a case is considered to be international terrorism. Given how that's applied, what it appears to me is that informants who are deputized to investigate Muslim communities more broadly are subject to less oversight than those who would be investigating what is thought of as domestic terrorism. I suppose my answer to your question is both that there are other investigative techniques, but even within use of this technique, there can be more internal and external oversight.
Thank you.
How successful or effective do you think the SPLC has been in raising the profile of domestic terrorism, at least as it gets to decision makers in Washington?
So that's an interesting question. So the Southern Poverty Law Center is what you're referring to. Southern Poverty Law Center has this history of going after groups like the Ku Klux Klan and bringing to light hate groups, hate violence, and threats of that sort. In recent years, they're facing a little bit of a challenge in terms of political pushback because of this perennial question of what gets labeled a hate group. And so while they track groups on both the right and the left, and actually they have this hate watch map where they kind of track the numbers of groups that are targeting particular, I think their definition is sort of targeting an entire group or expressing animosity towards a group at large, some measure of what constitutes hate. And they track groups on both the right and the left, and their numbers suggest a fairly dramatic increase in such groups, actually including on the left over the last 5 or 6 years. So, traditionally that's been sought after as a bipartisan kind of neutral source of research. In our increasingly polarized environment, and due to the actual difficulties of drawing lines about what is hate and what is not hate, they've gotten a lot of flack in recent years about how they designate particular groups, especially those on the right. So in terms of how effective it's been, I think the organization has done a tremendous amount of work to monitor and bring to light the presence of hate. They've done some fantastic reporting and tracking. But if you're asking sort of about political effectiveness and getting that message across, like everything, it's interpreted in very polarized lines.
And they just got sued yesterday by the Proud Boys, by Gavin McGinnis.
Okay, yeah. Yes.
Do you see anything encouraging in the amount of hearings for new Attorney General Barr in your specialty?
Do I see anything encouraging in that? I have to think about it. I think it's important to have people in Justice Department across the government who are committed to rule of law values, and the more that people are questioned on their belief in rule of law, their kind of principled commitment to a Justice Department that maintains independence from the president, which is of course a crucial issue, and it's been a cornerstone for the Justice Department's at least philosophy, to have some amount of independence from the sort of purely political realm. That kind of questioning and investigation is important. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Any other last question? Wonderful. So please join me to